16 beautiful Hollywood actresses ruined by plastic surgery.
Hollywood sells one fantasy above all others, that beauty is permanent. That the right lighting, the right surgeon, and enough discipline can hold time still. And for decades, the women of this industry were handed a quiet ultimatum: stay young or disappear. But here is the part that never quite makes it into the glossy magazines. The same system that pressured women to change their faces was the first to mock them when they did. The same producers who once said you'd look better with a little work were the first to whisper she's had too much. It was a trap with no exit. This is not a list about ugliness. It never was. These are 16 women who were genuinely, undeniably beautiful, and who, for reasons that say far more about the industry than about them, became subjects of public dissection, tabloid headlines, and casual cruelty dressed up as entertainment. Their stories deserve more than before and after photographs. They deserve context. So that is what we are going to give them. Before we talk about what changed, let us remind ourselves of what Meg Ryan was. In 1989, when Harry Met Sally introduced audiences to a woman who was funny, warm, chaotic in the best way, and completely impossible not to root for. In 1993, Sleepless in Seattle made her the defining face of the romantic comedy genre. By the time You've Got Mail arrived in 1998, she was arguably the most reliably beloved actress in Hollywood. What made her work was precisely what made her look unusual by industry standards. She was not polished into symmetry. Her smile was crooked. Her energy was nervous and real. Audiences did not just admire her, they recognized themselves in her. Then she stepped away. And when she returned to public life in the mid-2000s, the conversation was not about her career. It was about her face. Photos circulated. Speculation spread. Tabloids ran comparisons with an enthusiasm that bordered on sport. Meg Ryan has never confirmed exactly what procedures she may or may not have had. But in a 2023 interview with the Wall Street Journal, she spoke plainly about what the scrutiny felt like, describing the cruelty around women's appearances as stupid and pushing back against a culture that treats a woman's face as public property. The bitter irony is that she was right. The very quality that made Meg Ryan a star, her relatability, her imperfection, her realness, was the thing the industry eventually turned against. And the women who watched her in those films grew up, got older, and were never warned that the same thing would happen to them. The story of Jennifer Grey is not really about plastic surgery. It is about identity, and what happens when the feature you were told was your flaw turns out to have been your signature. In 1987, Dirty Dancing made her one of the most recognizable young actresses in Hollywood. She was not cast because she looked like everyone else. She was cast, in large part, because she did not. Her nose was distinctive. Her face had character. Audiences felt the specificity of her. Then, in the early 1990s, she had rhinoplasty, twice, according to her own account. It was a personal choice, made under the same pressures that have followed women in entertainment for generations. But the result, as she later described it in her 2022 memoir Out of the Corner, was devastating in ways she had not anticipated. She wrote openly about becoming unrecognizable, not just to casting directors, but to herself. The phone calls stopped. The roles disappeared. The woman who had been Baby in Dirty Dancing looked in the mirror and no longer saw the person audiences remembered. In an interview with People magazine around the book's release, she reflected on the experience with remarkable clarity. "I had this perfectly fine nose," she said. "I went and had it done, and no one knew who I was." Jennifer Grey's story is taught, informally, in acting schools and industry circles as a cautionary tale about the difference between fitting Hollywood standard and being genuinely memorable. The lesson is painful. Sometimes the thing you were told to fix was the thing that made you irreplaceable. Mickey Rourke. Because this conversation cannot only be about women, even though the industry's cruelty lands hardest on them. In 1987, Angel Heart and Barfly established Rourke as one of the most magnetic screen presences of his generation. Dark, unpredictable, intensely physical. By 1989, Johnny Handsome and a string of acclaimed roles had critics calling him a successor to Brando. Then came boxing. Then came the injuries. And then came the surgeries. Multiple reconstructive procedures after professional fighting, followed by what Rourke himself has described as work that did not go as planned. In a 2009 interview with the Sunday Times, he admitted that some of the surgical work had been botched, and that he was aware of how dramatically his appearance had changed. His comeback in The Wrestler in 2008, directed by Darren Aronofsky, earned him an Academy Award nomination and reminded audiences of what he was capable of. But the conversation around his face never fully disappeared. The difference, and it matters, is that when Mickey Rourke walked a red carpet looking different than he had in 1985, the coverage was largely sympathetic, curious, perhaps, but rarely vicious. Compare that to the treatment women in this video received for far less dramatic changes, and the double standard becomes impossible to ignore. Donatella Versace is one of the most powerful figures in the history of fashion. That sentence should not require qualification. And yet, for much of the past 20 years, the public conversation about her has been dominated not by her influence on design, but by her appearance. She helped build the Versace brand alongside her brother Johnny from the ground up. After his murder in 1997, an event of devastating personal violence, not simply a business disruption, she stepped into the role of creative director and kept one of the most recognizable luxury houses in the world not only alive but relevant. She did this while grieving publicly, in an industry that watches and judges everything. Over the years, she has been open about her relationship with plastic surgery and cosmetic procedures. In a 2016 profile by The Guardian, she spoke candidly about the pressures of living inside the beauty industry, and about her friendship with the late supermodel Naomi Campbell in navigating a world that treats women's bodies as aesthetic objects first. Here is the question that rarely gets asked. In an industry whose entire economic model is built on selling an idealized version of beauty, what does it mean to hold the woman at the top of that industry to a standard of aging naturally? Donatella Versace did not invent the pressure she lived under. She inherited it, along with everything else. Her legacy is not her face. It is decades of creative output, one of fashion's most difficult succession stories managed with genuine skill, and an empire that outlasted the grief that could easily have destroyed it. Lisa Rinna has been one of the more unusually honest voices in Hollywood's long, uncomfortable conversation about cosmetic work. She rose to prominence in the mid-1990s through Days of Our Lives and later Melrose Place, and built a second act through reality television and her role on The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. She has also, over the years, been one of the few celebrities to speak directly and without significant hedging about the work she has had done, including lip augmentation that began in the early 1990s and which she has described, in multiple interviews, as a decision she came to regret. In 2010, she told People magazine that she had had the filler removed and that her lips had been a source of personal distress for years. In subsequent interviews, she spoke about the way a single cosmetic decision made in her 20s had followed her throughout her career, becoming her most discussed feature regardless of anything else she achieved. What makes her story instructive is that the regret she expressed was not about aging or about looking different. It was about making a permanent-ish decision under industry pressure at an age when she did not fully understand the long-term implications. She was young. She was told lips like that were desirable. She complied. And then she spent years being defined by compliance. That cycle, pressure, procedure, regret, scrutiny, is the through line that connects nearly every woman in this video. Daryl Hannah was one of the most genuinely striking presences in 1980s Hollywood. Splash in 1984. Blade Runner in 1982. Steel Magnolias in 1989. She was tall, unusual-looking in a way that read as genuinely otherworldly and capable of enormous range. She also, by most accounts, found the industry deeply uncomfortable. She has spoken in interviews about being introverted, about disliking the publicity machine, and about the difficulty of navigating a business that turns people into products. As the years passed and her appearance changed, as appearances do, the public speculation followed. Unlike many of her peers, Hannah largely withdrew from the spotlight rather than engaging with it, which in Hollywood is itself treated as a kind of suspicious behavior. In 2013, she disclosed publicly that she had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder as a child, and that many of the qualities the industry had found difficult, the social withdrawal, the discomfort with attention, the preference for privacy, had roots in neurological difference rather than eccentricity. That context matters enormously when reading her story back. A woman who found public scrutiny genuinely painful, who preferred animals and activism and quiet work to red carpets, was nonetheless dragged into the same tabloid conversation about her face that swallowed everyone else. Her choices about her appearance, whatever they were, belonged to her. The conversation that followed them did not. Lara Flynn Boyle had one of the more quietly impressive careers of the 1990s. Twin Peaks, David Lynch's landmark television series, gave her a role of genuine emotional complexity. The practice, the legal drama, earned her strong reviews across multiple seasons. She was working consistently, well, and in serious material. Then her appearance became the story. By the early 2000s, tabloid coverage of her had shifted almost entirely from her work to her body. First her weight, then her face, then the combination of both. The coverage was not gentle. It was not curious. It was the particular cruelty that American celebrity journalism specializes in: intimate, photographic, relentless, and completely without accountability. Lara Flynn Boyle has given very few interviews in recent years, which is her right. What her story illustrates is something worth naming clearly. The timeline from celebrated actress to tabloid subject in her case was remarkably short, and the transition was triggered not by any change in her talent but by changes in her body and face that the press decided were public business. That is not a story about plastic surgery. It is a story about what the media does to women who exist in bodies. Working Girl in 1988 should have been the beginning of a very different career arc. Melanie Griffith's performance as Tess McGill, ambitious, funny, smarter than everyone around her gave her credit for, earned her an Academy Award nomination and positioned her as one of Hollywood's most interesting leading women. The years that followed were complicated by factors that had nothing to do with talent. Recovery from addiction. Relationships that played out in public. A beauty standard that, as she aged, became increasingly difficult to meet and increasingly difficult to escape. In a 2017 interview with Porter magazine, Griffith spoke with unusual candor about her experience with cosmetic procedures, saying she had not fully understood how the changes would look until public and press reaction made it impossible to ignore. She described the experience of seeing herself through other people's eyes as disorienting. That disorientation is worth sitting with. She had been photographed, watched, and evaluated her entire adult life. And still, the gap between how she experienced her own face and how others projected onto it was wide enough to cause genuine distress. The lesson is not that she made wrong choices. The lesson is that no choice a woman makes about her appearance exists in a vacuum when that woman is famous. Every decision becomes subject to public analysis, and the analysis is rarely kind. Pamela Anderson's story in the 1990s is inseparable from a particular American cultural moment, one in which a woman's body could be simultaneously celebrated, objectified, violated, and mocked, sometimes within the same magazine issue. Baywatch made her globally recognized. The tabloids made her a target. The unauthorized distribution of a private videotape in 1996, a crime, not a scandal, subjected her to public humiliation on a scale that had no real precedent at the time and for which the perpetrators faced minimal consequences. Through all of this, her appearance was treated as open for comment. Breast augmentation surgery she had in the early 1990s became a permanent fixture of her public identity, referenced endlessly, treated as defining. In 2009, she had implants removed, also reported extensively, also treated as defining. What changed in the 2020s was that Pamela Anderson began telling her own story. Her 2023 Netflix documentary Pamela, A Love Story, and the accompanying memoir Love, Pamela, gave her the opportunity to reframe decades of narrative that had largely been written by other people. She appeared at multiple public events without makeup, which became its own story, covered as a statement, which perhaps it was. In an interview with Variety around the documentary's release, she described the experience of reclaiming her own narrative as transformative. Whatever the public chose to make of her appearance at any point in her life, she said, it had always belonged to her. That is a simple statement. It should not be a radical one. But given everything that preceded it, it was. Jessica Simpson's relationship with public scrutiny of her body is one of the more extensively documented cases in modern celebrity culture, and one of the more depressing. She arrived in the late 1990s as a pop singer, crossed into reality television with Newlyweds, and built a business empire, the Jessica Simpson Collection, that, according to Forbes, generated over $1 billion in annual revenue by 2014, making it one of the most successful celebrity-branded fashion lines in history. None of that, as it turned out, was sufficient protection from the tabloid gaze. In 2009, photographs of her performing in high-waisted jeans and a belt sparked a wave of commentary about her weight that she has described, in her 2020 memoir Open Book, as genuinely traumatizing. She wrote extensively about the experience and about her relationship with food, alcohol, and diet pills, habits that had developed partly in response to the constant public evaluation of her body. Her memoir is a useful primary source precisely because it refuses the easy narrative. She does not cast herself as purely a victim, and she does not excuse the industry. She describes a system that celebrates women for their appearance, penalizes them when that appearance changes, and then expresses concern for their well-being when the psychological cost of all that scrutiny becomes visible. The cosmetic procedures she has had over the years are, in the context of that system, almost beside the point. What the industry did to Jessica Simpson's self-image long before any surgeon was involved is the actual story. Courtney Cox is an interesting case because she is one of the relatively few celebrities who has spoken about reversing cosmetic procedures. She rose to global recognition through Friends, where she played Monica Geller for a decade, a character defined by intensity, competitiveness, and genuine comic precision. After Friends ended in 2004, she continued working in Cougar Town and other projects, maintaining a consistent public presence. By the mid-2010s, she was appearing at events and in interviews looking noticeably different from her earlier work. In a 2017 interview with New Beauty magazine, she addressed this directly, saying she had dissolved a significant amount of filler and described the process of getting work done as one in which you do not notice the gradual change until suddenly you do not look like yourself anymore. That observation, that cosmetic alteration can happen incrementally and that the cumulative effect can become visible only in retrospect, is one of the more honest things any celebrity has said about the subject. It removes the assumption that every procedure is a deliberate aesthetic statement and replaces it with something more human, a series of small decisions made under pressure that add up to something unintended. She has continued working, and the coverage of her appearance has been largely positive in recent years, in part, perhaps, because the reversal narrative satisfies a particular public appetite. But her story is more complicated than a redemption arc. It is about the nature of the pressure itself, and why the industry creates it. Tara Reid's career trajectory in the late 1990s and early 2000s is genuinely difficult to discuss without also discussing how the entertainment press treated her. She appeared in American Pie in 1999 and Van Wilder in 2002 to solid commercial response. She was young, photogenic, and working consistently. Then, in 2004, a wardrobe malfunction at a public event exposed scarring from liposuction and a breast augmentation procedure that had not healed well. The photographs were published widely and without her consent. The coverage that followed was not sympathetic. It was mocking. Late-night jokes were made. Magazine pieces were written with a specificity of cruelty that would probably not be published in the same form today. Her medical history, her choices about her own body, and the results of a procedure that had gone wrong were turned into entertainment. She has spoken in interviews about how that coverage affected her, and about a period of her life that involved significant personal difficulty. The New York Times, in a 2013 profile, described the way celebrity media of that era handled women's bodies as a specific cultural mode that had largely moved on, though whether it has truly moved on remains a reasonable question. Tara Reid deserved better from the press. That is not a complicated sentence. But it is one that takes too long to become obvious in retrospect. Cher occupies a genuinely singular position in this conversation, because she was one of the first celebrities to speak about plastic surgery openly, and because her willingness to do so was treated, at the time, as both refreshing and faintly scandalous. She has been in public life since the 1960s. She has had a recording career, a film career, including an Academy Award for Moonstruck in 1988, a concert touring career, and a cultural presence that has outlasted multiple generations of trends, critics, and pop cultural moments. Over the decades, she has been open about having had multiple procedures, including rhinoplasty and work on her teeth and chin. In a 1988 interview with People magazine, she directly addressed the subject, saying she did not think it was anybody's business but that she chose to be honest. She also made a point that has aged remarkably well. She said it was her body, and she could do what she wanted to with it. What makes Cher's case different from many others here is agency. She was not squeezed into surgery by an industry that told her she was no longer enough. She described her choices as her own. That is not to say the pressure did not exist. It always does, in an industry built on visual appeal, but the way she narrated her story was one of ownership rather than compliance. The public treated her differently for it, sometimes admiringly, sometimes with a kind of absurdist fascination that her persona had always invited. But the cruelty that greeted many of the women in this video was mostly absent. Perhaps because Cher had built a persona large enough to absorb it. Perhaps because she dared them to try. Rose McGowan's story involves plastic surgery in a way that is often left out of the conversation. It was not entirely voluntary. She appeared in Scream in 1996 and Charmed from 1999, building a recognizable career in horror and genre television. In 2007, she was in a serious car accident in which her seatbelt cut deeply into her face. She required significant reconstructive surgery on her eye and the surrounding area. What followed, in tabloid coverage, was a period in which photographs of her post-surgery appearance were circulated and discussed as though she had chosen to alter her face for vanity. The reconstructive nature of the work was not always acknowledged. The commentary was not always kind. In interviews from that period, she addressed the accident and the surgery directly, expressing frustration at being discussed in terms of cosmetic choice when the procedures had been medically necessary. Her story later became more prominently associated with her role as one of the first public accusers in what became the Harvey Weinstein case, a figure she discussed naming publicly as early as 2017 in the New York Times, reporting by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey that helped initiate the wider reckoning. But before all of that, she was a woman whose medical history had been turned, without her consent, into tabloid content. The tendency to treat every change to a celebrity's face as cosmetic vanity, rather than asking what actually happened, is one of the less examined habits of the entertainment press. In 2010, Heidi Montag became the subject of a People magazine cover story about undergoing 10 cosmetic procedures in a single day. She had risen to prominence through The Hills, the MTV reality series that ran from 2006 to 2010, alongside Spencer Pratt. It was a show that was built, explicitly, on the aesthetics of Southern California youth culture: beauty, aspiration, social performance. The pressure to look a particular way was not incidental to the format. It was the format. By her own account in multiple interviews, including in People and on subsequent reality programming, the procedures she underwent were extensive: rhinoplasty, brow lift, ear pinning, chin reduction, breast augmentation, and more. She was 23 years old. She has spoken since about physical consequences, chronic pain, limited movement in certain muscles, and about the psychological weight of having made those decisions so young and so publicly. In a 2013 interview, she described wishing she could have backed the nose she was born with. Heidi Montag's story is a useful lens on what happens when the entertainment industry specifically targets very young women who are still developing their sense of self and presents cosmetic alteration not as an option but as an expectation. She was on a television show that celebrated a particular aesthetic. She absorbed that message. She acted on it. And then she lived with the consequences in public. The industry that created the pressure received almost none of the criticism that landed on her. Few people have lived under the public eye as long or as relentlessly as Janet Jackson. She grew up performing. She became a television actress before she became a recording artist. By the time Control arrived in 1986, she was in her 20s and building an artistic identity completely separate from the family name she carried. Rhythm Nation 1814 in 1989 sold over 12 million copies in the United States alone, according to the Recording Industry Association of America. Her influence on choreography, on female performance in pop music, and on the integration of political messaging into mainstream entertainment is extensively documented. Through all of it, her body was treated as public property. Her weight fluctuated over the decades, something she addressed openly in interviews, describing periods of significant personal difficulty and recovery. Each fluctuation was photographed, analyzed, and published. Her face changed over time, as faces do, and the speculation followed. Then, in 2004, the Super Bowl halftime show. An incident that lasted less than a second was covered for years. Janet Jackson's career was meaningfully affected by a broadcasting decision that was not entirely hers and for which, as contemporaneous reporting and later retrospective coverage in outlets including the New York Times and Rolling Stone confirmed, she bore consequences disproportionate to anyone else involved. The scrutiny of her appearance was one thread in a much larger pattern, a culture that found it easier to comment on how Janet Jackson looked than to reckon with how she had been treated. Her most recent album cycle and documentary coverage have begun to shift that framing. But the years spent under a kind of surveillance that followed her from childhood through middle age deserve acknowledgement before we talk about any surgical procedure. 16 women, 16 stories, and a single recurring pattern underneath all of them. Hollywood creates the pressure. Hollywood profits from the pressure. And then Hollywood, and the culture around it, turns on the women who responded to the pressure and treats their choices as the source of the problem. Not one of the women in this video deserved the coverage they received. Not one of their choices about their own bodies warranted the public investigation that followed. And the industry that shaped the environment in which those choices were made has never been held to meaningful account for what it built. The before and after photographs that circulate endlessly on the internet are not documentation of failure. They are documentation of what it costs to exist as a woman in public, the pressure to change, and then the punishment for changing, running in an endless loop that the camera never turns off. These women were beautiful. More importantly, they were talented, resilient, complicated, and human. Those things were always more interesting than their faces. If you found this worthwhile,